I had a little bit of a scary run-in with the law a couple years back. Had a little scary encounter with some coppers. So I, what I'll say about it is, well, first of all right, let me just full disclosure. Technically, the story isn't directly about me. It didn't happen like to me directly, but I was there, and it did take place at my house. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm the main character. All right. So what I'll say is, one night we have a friend that came in from out of town with his family. He will remain unnamed because I failed to get his permission to talk about him this morning. So we had a friend who came in from out of town with his family, and they were staying with us. And they flew into the airport, rented a car, came over to the house. We hung out the whole rest of that day. And then, eventually we all got tired and went to bed. Well, I guess it was about 2:00 that morning. This is what I hear. Somebody's beating on the door. I'm like, now, who is this? When I rolled over and saw what time it was, I don't take kindly to being woken up like that. So I'm like, who in the world is knocking on my door at 2 a.m.? So I go and drag myself to the front, open the door, after looking through the little peephole, of course. And there's a bunch of cops in my front yard. And the one cop in front says, "Is that your car parked in front of your house there?" And I'm looking, I said, "Actually, no, that's my friend's car who's staying with us. It's a rental. He rented that car." He said, "Oh, well, we're going to need to talk to your friend." So, by that time, we're all up. We're all already awake. So I go and I tell him, I was like, "Yes, some people at the door want to talk to you." So he comes up and, he goes through the same exchange with the cops. And the guy says, "Well, that car's been reported stolen. And so, do you have the paperwork, to kind of back up, what you're telling me?" He's like, "Well, yeah, I'll go get the paperwork." So he goes and he gets the rental paperwork, gives it to the cop. The cop goes back out to the squad car for a couple minutes. He's looking over everything, and me and my friend are just kind of standing in the front yard. Everybody else is cowering in the house somewhere, probably looking out the windows. But we're just kind of standing there waiting. And then finally the cop comes back after a minute. He says, "Well, I got some bad news for you. You're going to jail." And then he waits a beat, and he says, "No, I'm just kidding." Like, this cop's got jokes. I didn't know they could do that. I didn't know they could joke about something like that. But he's like, "No, I'm just kidding." He said, "Actually, so what ended up happening, what we found out was the car had, in fact, been reported stolen previously by the rental company. They recovered the car, but failed to call the police back and say that they had the car. So the car was still on the in the system as being stolen. And then they rented it to my friend, of course, and he was driving, and one of the little traffic cameras in my neighborhood had snapped a picture of the license plate, and they had been driving around looking for a couple hours trying to find the car." And he actually said, "It's lucky for you that you made it to the house and went inside before we found you, because had you been in the car when we found you, we would have been having this conversation at gunpoint." and I'm thinking to myself, and I'm trying to remember if that was the night we went out, he and I, and got food for everybody and come back. I can't remember if it was that night or the next day, but the thought that I could have just been kneeling on the ground with a gun pointed at me while he's arguing with the cops, like, "No, it's a rental car, I didn't steal it," is just something that to this day, it's one of those great what ifs. What if this would have happened that particular way. But I just, as we reflect on that, we think about, I don't know what your backgrounds are. I don't know if any of you were like bandits or bank robbers in your previous life. Sorry, I've been watching a lot of Little House on the Prairie. But I don't know if you've had like run-ins with the law and that kind of thing. But, typically speaking, there's a certain feeling you have when you're answering questions from a police officer, and they're kind of like asking you these things and interrogating you and grilling you a little bit. And the story we're about to read, the account that we're about to read, Jesus has a run-in with the law. the equivalent of the police of his day, of the Westwego Police or the Wagaman Police Department, the Jefferson Parish, the equivalent of them, they come to get him and question him, and he has his own little run-in with the law. But what we're going to see, though, is that there's some big differences between when Jesus has a run-in with the law and when we have a run-in with the law. Lots of differences, a lot of subversion of expectations of what you would have expected. Subversions of, the power structure, who's got the power, who's answering the questions, who's asking the questions, and all of that kind of stuff. And so we're going to see some distinctions. We're going to see two really big distinctions in this text. I'm calling it Jesus Christ shot caller. Because Jesus, we're going to see, he's the one calling the shots. He's the one with all the power. He's the one holding all the cards. So if you haven't done so already, let's go ahead and just flip over to the Gospel of John, chapter 18. We're going to look at the story today down to verse 27. To start with, we're going to read verses 1 through 12. And then we're going to break some of this stuff down. So let's read together. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. So he asked them again, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken, "Of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one." Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. So the first distinction I want us to see this morning, we're going to see Jesus calling the shots before the betrayer and his cohorts. That's the first distinction. So here's the thing. I mentioned a moment ago the scenario that played out with my own little experience with the law. I did fight the law, except I won. And so I mentioned that. But here's the thing. Now I want to just kind of take that, and I want us to just kind of just put maybe you've had an experience like that. I don't know, but try to put yourself in that situation mentally, like a situation like that. Picture yourself at your house, minding your own business, and then maybe you hear a ruckus outside or something. You hear some sort of disturbance. You look out your window. There's cops advancing towards your front door. You don't know what they want, but they're definitely coming to your house. And then you hear it. "Police, open up!" So you open the door. And now you're standing face to face with one or more police officers, and they say to you, "Are you Mr. So-and-so? Are you Mrs. So-and-so?" You're like, yeah, I am. Is everything, is everything okay? What can I do for you? What's up? Where were you last Wednesday night at 6:30 p.m.? Now, if you're a good little boy or girl, you can say, "I was at Gretna Covenant Church at the Wednesday night Bible study." If you're a good little boy or girl. No offense if you weren't there, but hey, it's a good reason to come to the Bible studies because you get your soul edified and you have an alibi. All right, and in fact, we had a really awesome discussion this past Wednesday about Jesus and how he endured all the same types of sufferings that we endure, and I thought it was a really good, edifying discussion. We had lots of great feedback, so you if you were here, you would have gotten to hear that, and you would have the alibi. So the cop says, where were you last Wednesday at 6:30 p.m.? So it's at this moment what I want you to think about. I've had a few little times. I've been pulled over a time or two in my life and things like that. Just think about the types of what's going through your head in that moment. What's your emotional state? Are you nervous? What is your psychological state? But even more than that, physiologically, what's happening to you? Because if you're nervous, are you experiencing symptoms of nervousness? Are you stuttering a little bit? Trying to think of your words, trying to get your words out. Do you have that weird little feeling in your chest? You get that little lump in the bottom of your throat, like when you're like just really, really nervous. Maybe your palms are getting a little sweaty. Maybe you're getting a little antsy. You're kind of shuffling, and you're like, oh, does this make me look guilty? I better. All these thoughts are going through your head. Are you maybe cowering a little bit behind that door? Are you kind of using that door a little bit like a shield? I want us to be thinking about these kinds of things, because in that moment there's going to be a clear power dynamic. This officer of the law who's advanced onto your property, and he's asking you these questions, and you're the one kind of on the defense. And just all the things you're going through in that moment, just get that firmly in mind, and then notice as we look at this narrative today, contrast this with the kind of behavior that we're going to be seeing from Jesus throughout this entire episode. Contrast how we would be responding in the presence of the law with what we see from Jesus throughout this entire narrative. And as we walk through this, I want you to be paying attention to the differences. All right, so we start at verse 1. What does verse 1 tell us? It's setting the scene. Jesus and the disciples, it says after, when he had spoken these words, and so that's a little transition statement. What are the words? But, last week we saw that high priestly prayer. We heard Jesus praying for us, right? Remember that? He prayed for us individually and specifically. He was praying for us. We start today with, after he had said these words, they continued moving along. They came to the Kidron Valley, where the text says there was a garden. All right, so the thing to understand here is the Kidron Valley, this is a little valley with a ravine running through it that sits just to the east of Jerusalem. And on the other side of the valley is the Mount of Olives. And it's at the foot of the Mount of Olives that is the site of the Garden of Gethsemane. And that's the garden where this whole kind of situation is taking place. That's where Jesus had, the agony in the garden, and that's where these events are taking place while he's waiting for, he knows he's waiting for these people to come arrest him. And so the Kidron Valley is the valley. It's sitting between the Mount of Olives and Jerusalem. Okay, and these are important details, because the Mount of Olives, we read, if you go look at Luke's gospel, the Gospel of Luke tells us that during that Passion Week, the final week of Jesus' life, he would go and spend the night on that mountain every night. That's where he went to get away, and he would spend the night there. But then John tells us right here in verse 2, John tells us that this was also Jesus' habit of taking his disciples with him into this area, into this garden. This was a normal practice of theirs, to go hang out in this garden, to go pray and things like that. And this is known. And this is actually the means by which Judas sets his trap. Because up until that very night, Judas had been one of those disciples. And so he had the inside information. He knew Jesus's habits. He knew Jesus's ways. He knew Jesus's practices. He knew the things Jesus did. He had this inside information. And that's the information. He actually uses his inside information to spring a trap on Jesus that we see right there in verses 2 and 3. And if you ask me, which, you hired me to preach here, so you did, but if you ask me, that makes the treachery so much worse. Because it's not just that he betrayed Jesus, it's that he was Jesus's friend and used inside information he had as his friend to spring the trap on him that got him arrested and eventually executed. And so this past Wednesday night at the study we had here, we were talking about the fact that Jesus, he has, in the flesh, he has experienced all of the same types of trials and pains and temptations that we experience, as human beings. Jesus knows the sting of having a friend who knows everything about him turn his back on him and betray him. This is not a God who just sits in his ivory tower and barks orders at us. This is a God who came here and voluntarily endured the exact same types of things that his beloved creation has to endure every day. And so he knows about being betrayed by friends and being stabbed in the back by friends. And, maybe you know that pain yourself. Maybe you've had a friend who just knew everything about you. Maybe it was somebody you confided in. They had inside information about you, stuff that maybe you told them in confidence, only for them to turn around and use that information and stab you in the back. Maybe you felt that pain. Because it is painful, isn't it? If you've experienced it, it is. But Jesus knows from firsthand experience just how painful that is. And look, history's had many guys like this who have betrayed their own people or their own friends or their own country. History has these people. And if you've been paying attention to the history books, if you remember from school, history tends to not remember these people very fondly at all. The Judases and the Benedict Arnolds. And, history just doesn't remember these people very well. If you've ever seen the movie 300. Now, the movie is a highly fictionalized account, but the events that the movie is based on are true historic events. It's the dramatic and heroic story of 300 Spartan warriors fending off the Persian army for wave after wave after wave of attack. That really happened. That's a historical event. But there was a guy by the name of Ephialtes who was himself a Spartan. And, history doesn't tell us a lot about him. We don't know a lot about him. In fact, the little bit we do know comes from the historian Cicero, if you know that name. But all we really know about Ephialtes is that he was himself a Spartan, and he betrayed the Spartans and sold them out to the Persians, and the Persians then were able to conquer the Spartans because of his betrayal. That's a historical event. Now the movie had to fill in a lot of details creatively to tell that story because we don't know a lot about him. The movie portrayed him as this deformed guy who wanted to be in the army. And so they were going to let him try out. They put him through the trials, but during the trials, they found out that he couldn't get the shield high enough because of his deformity. And if you know anything about their regime, their whole thing was they made this phalanx out of their shields. They made this big old shield wall, and it was supposed to be impenetrable. And everybody had to lock shields a certain way. Well, he couldn't get the shield high enough, so they said, you can't be in the army. We're sorry. They graciously gave him the opportunity, other ways he could help, but, that wasn't good enough for him. So he got his feelings hurt, and what does he do? He runs over to the Persians. He gives them inside information that allows them to win. And so the Spartans had this just amazing dramatic stand, 300 against this huge Persian army. And it all came to an end through treachery. That's Ephialtes. And the same thing that makes the same thing that makes his betrayal so treacherous is the same thing that makes Judas's treachery so treacherous. He was a Spartan. And as a Spartan, he knew things about the Spartans that nobody else knew. And then he went and used that information and gave it to the enemy so that they could come over and kill his brothers. And that's the same thing we see with Judas. Judas had inside information because he was one of those disciples. He was Jesus's friend. He followed the man around for 3 years. The man loved him. He knew his ways. And he says, I know just how to get him because I know where he's going to be. So he betrayed him. And in verse 3, we see him leading this army or this group into the garden where Jesus is. And if you're paying attention, what you're going to see there is there's two groups of people in that coalition that Judas brings. There's two different groups of people. There's a bunch of Roman soldiers. The first group, they're Roman soldiers. John uses a technical military term that loosely translates to cohort. And in fact, point number 1, I said between the betrayer and his cohorts. He uses a technical military term. A cohort would have been about 600 Roman soldiers. Now, we don't actually think that he came with 600 soldiers. More than likely, this is a detachment of a cohort. So some group of soldiers from a cohort. But also there's Jewish officers from the temple. So he's got Roman soldiers and Jewish officers. The Jewish officers, these would have been like the temple police. These would have been guys like back in, I think it was like John chapter 11-ish, the group that the religious leaders wanted to arrest Jesus, and they stood off to the side and they were looking for a good time to go arrest him, but they couldn't because the crowds never let up. It was a group, it's that same kind of group. I wonder if it was maybe even some of the same people that were in that group. But Judas shows up with all these people, and this is where things get really, really interesting. This is where things get really interesting, because it's from this moment on that we see all those distinctions that I was alluding to earlier, and they're about to just come flying at us, like left and right and left and right. Because despite everything else that's going on, what we're going to see here now from verses 4 through 8 is that Jesus is the one who is in control the entire time, and Jesus is the one calling the shots. So first of all, notice who is going out to whom in verses 4 through 8. Notice who's going to who. Remember, in all of my stories, it's always the cops that are advancing, right? The cops are walking towards the door. The cops are coming. You're kind of cowering back, right? They're coming to you. Notice in verses 4 through 8, who's going out to who. These guys show up in the garden. Jesus isn't cowering behind a door. Jesus isn't hiding behind a fig leaf. Jesus turns around and he goes out to them. He goes walking right out to them. Jesus goes to them and Jesus calls out, "Whom do you seek?" Let's flip that around. The cop's at my door. What is he saying? "Are you Mr. So-and-so? Where were you last Wednesday at 6:30? Who's asking the questions and who's answering the questions? The one in power, the one in control, right? Who's asking the questions in John chapter 18? Jesus goes out. He's not waiting for them to say, "Are you Mr. Jesus?" Jesus goes out and he's like, "Who are you seeking? Who are you looking for?" Jesus is asking the questions. Jesus is advancing on them, and Jesus is asking the questions. He doesn't just ask the question once. He has to say it twice, because the first time something really weird happens, doesn't it? The first time something really weird happens. Jesus says, "Who are you seeking?" And they answer with the name of a man. We're looking for the man, Jesus, from the town of Nazareth. They answer with a man's name. And then Jesus fires back with a God's name. This English translation here kind of loses this a little bit. But in Greek, Jesus doesn't say, "I am he." Jesus shouts back, and you've heard me use these words before. If you dial it in and think about it, Jesus shouts back, "Ego eimi." Greek for "I am." That's what he shouts back. It's that divine name of God. And we've talked about this. He's done this before in this gospel, remember? I am the bread of life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the good shepherd. I am the living water. I am. Every time Jesus says I am, somebody wants to kill him, because that is the divine name of God. All the way back in the Old Testament, in Exodus, Moses asks God, what is your name? So that I can tell these people who sent me. And God tells him, I am who I am. That's what he tells him. In Hebrew, Yahweh. I am. That's his name. I am. They call out to him, we're looking for this man, Jesus of Nazareth. They answer with a man's name. Jesus shouts back with his God name. I am. And look, man, we can conjecture all day about what happened at that point. But all I can say is that when he shouted his divine name, the dudes fell down. They drew back and they fell down. This isn't the cop advancing on me and I'm backing up. Jesus is advancing on them and they're backing up and they're falling down. Jesus said, I am. And in that moment, they just fell. What was it? What knocked him down? Was it just his voice? Was it the power of his voice? Was it the divine name? Yes, all the above maybe, but they fell. They fell. And all I can think about, if you ever just really read your Bible with and you really just dial into this, every time somebody in the Bible has a true, genuine encounter with God, what's the first thing they do when that encounter starts, when they realize they're in the presence of God? They fall. Every single time. If anyone ever asks you, what's the first thing you're going to do when you get to heaven and you see God for the first time? The only true biblical answer you can give is say, I'm going to fall down. I'm going to fall down. That's the right answer to that question. I guarantee you, whatever questions you want to ask about JFK, about any of it, the right answer is, I'm going to fall down. After you get up, then you can ask your questions. But I guarantee you, you're going to fall down. Jesus shouts back the divine name. They all fall. And then guess what else happens? Verse 8, Jesus starts giving them orders. In Greek, that is an imperative. He is telling them, you're going to let these people go. You came for me? Get me. Let them go. Do we give orders to the cops when the cops are telling you? No, it's the other way around, right? Go get those papers out the car so we can verify your story, right? And then if you're really unlucky, it's put your hands on the hood, right? They're giving the orders. They're telling you. Jesus is telling them what to do. So I hope you see this whole time, there's this complete subversion of who's in power and who's in control. And the point is here, ultimately, they did not capture Jesus. Jesus handed himself over to them. Because if you're going to tell me for 1 second that if he could just knock them down with the sound of his voice, he couldn't have just strolled right out of that garden while they're on the ground? Jesus can be gone in a heartbeat. They did not capture Jesus. Jesus gave himself to them because that's what he came to do. And you gotta love Peter. Dude straight up says, man, he just knocked everybody down with a voice. I know, I'm going to take out my little puny sword and start swinging. Peter, I love him. Put a pin in that. I'm not going to comment further on Peter cutting off the ear tonight, this morning. Sorry. I'm picturing the scene at night. I'm not going to comment further on that this morning, but we're going to talk more about that next week. There's something I want you to see next week. We're gonna put a pin in that, and we're gonna come back to that. The second distinction we're gonna see from this story is Jesus calling the shots before the high priest and his minions. Well, let's pick up in verse 13. We're gonna read down to verse 27 real quick. Verse 13. First, they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold. Let's put a pin in that one too. I'm not going to comment on this today. Charcoal fire. You know what charcoal smells like? You ever been near a charcoal fire? Maybe you grilled with charcoal in your backyard. You know what that smells like? All right, we're going to stick a pin in that. We're going to revisit that in a couple of weeks. But remember that detail. Remember that I said that when we come back to it. But they made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said." When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, "You also are not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. And by the way, this is just a little bit of lagniappe for you, but every time you see Peter say, "I am not," in Greek, that is a different Greek expression, ouk eimi. And if you're reading this in Greek, you're going to notice the contrast between Jesus saying, "Ego eimi," and then Peter, "Ouk eimi." Ouk is a negation. Ouk means no, not. So you see these two statements contrasted against each other. Jesus saying, "I am," and Peter saying, "I am not." Ego eimi, ouk eimi. And that's just one of those really neat contrasts you see in this text. The second distinction we see in this text for the structure of the sermon is we see Jesus calling the shots before the high priest and his minions. And here's the key to understanding the dynamics of these verses right here, verses 13 through 27. And again, I'm just going to let you know, it is the subversion of the typical power structure in these types of encounters. In this case, Jesus has now been dragged in front of the high priest for this interrogation. So he's being interrogated basically in front of this guy. And presumably, therefore, the priest Annas is the one with the power. Just like presumably the guards were the ones with the power a moment ago. But notice, again, who's actually in charge. Notice how Jesus effectively shatters the illusion or that these guys are in control of the situation. He shatters that completely by the things he says in verses 13 through 27. The first thing to understand about this whole setup is it's a sham. It is a complete and utter sham. And I hope you get that. This whole questioning or trial or whatever you want to call it, it is a farce. It is a mockery of justice. Caiaphas, all the way back in John chapter 11, had already decided that they should kill Jesus. He was the one who said in chapter 11 that it was better for that one man would die for the people than that the whole nation would perish. That was him who said that. That's what verse 14 that we just read today, that's what verse 14 was alluding back to. So if that sounded familiar, that's why. We've heard this before. And it was in John chapter 11, right after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. That's when this happened. That's when the people really started getting nervous because, I mean, who does that? Who raises people from the dead? And the religious leaders, they banded together and they had already made this decision. So again, this whole trial, it's a mockery of justice. That's all it is. That's all it is. The outcome is already known. The outcome has already been decided. That's all. In fact, at a real trial, they would have been required to produce witnesses. According to their law, there should have been some witnesses present. And that's one of the first things Jesus exposes when he answers the guy. And we see that in verses 20 and 21. Jesus says, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple. And I've said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. In other words, where's your witnesses? Why are you asking me? You're the one bringing these charges. Where's the witnesses? I've been teaching publicly in the temple, in the synagogues. Everybody's heard me. Where are these people who heard me that are supposedly going to testify about this so-called heresy? These things you're saying I said that I shouldn't have said. Where are they to give testimony to this? And does Annas back off at that point and say, yeah, dog, you're right? No. No, they double down. They double down on their hideousness and they commit another injustice. One of these officials standing by smacks Jesus across the face. And the Greek term John uses here is the term for an an open hand slap to the face. I'm not trying to be callous here or anything, but he just this underling, this nobody, this lapdog, just gives Jesus the Will Smith special. I mean, he just hits him. Who do you think you are? And I'll tell you this, everything else we know about this story, I don't know why, but for some reason, despite everything else we know that Jesus endured, for some reason, this dude slapping Jesus like that, this just boils my blood. It does. But then if you look at verse 23, Jesus exposes him too. Jesus says, if what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? He's exposing him. He's just exposing the illegality of what he's doing. And so the point is, and what we're seeing here is Jesus is not threatened by either of these guys. He's not any more threatened by them than he was the other guys at the beginning. And he's not being cocky. He's not being disrespectful. He's just telling the truth, the plain truth, clearly and in a manner that indicates he's not threatened by any of this. That's all he's doing. And we're going to see the same pattern next week when Pontius Pilate starts interrogating him. We're going to see this same Jesus being in control kind of a situation. And the fact is, Jesus gets the upper hand, clearly. In verse 24, look at verse 24. Annas is like, I don't know. Send him to Caiaphas. Annas doesn't even speak again in the account. It's he's done. He's out. He's just send him to Caiaphas. Let Caiaphas deal with this. Annas is defeated. I think Annas knows he lost his round. They can't bring any charges against Jesus that are sticking. Jesus is exposing them left and right. He just sends them up the chain. Get rid of them. Jesus isn't scared. He's not cowering. And with a few well-spoken words, he's just exposed this entire thing as a sham. But there's also a third guy in these verses that provides a contrast with Jesus. And unfortunately, it's one of Jesus' own guys. It's Peter. Because we also see the infamous 3 denials of Peter here. And just to refresh your memory, because again, John 13, all the way through where we are now, this is one night. This is one series of events. It was that very same night, just a short while ago, Peter had boasted that he would lay down his life for Jesus. And Jesus correctly predicted, Jesus correctly told him, Peter, I know you mean well, but no, man. You're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster even crows. And I know that had to hit Peter like a ton of bricks. But let me just tell you, and as a guy who's been in Peter's shoes, I mean, not literally in that situation, but in similar, let me just say it like this. It's easy to say stuff like that, like, yeah, I'll lay down my life for you. It's easy to say stuff like that when you are safe and secure in a room, locked away from danger. Right? So easy. Now, I will say this in Peter's defense. In verse 10, he started to try to make good on that promise, right? He whips out the sword, he starts slashing. But let me tell you, it's easy to do stuff like that when you got your boys around you and you think they got your back. But deep in enemy territory, surrounded by unbelievers, Peter sings a different tune, doesn't he? Nope. It changes to Uk Emi. Uk Emi. I don't even know him. I don't even know him. But listen, if any of us think we would have done better in his place, if any of us think we would have done better in that courtyard that night, let me remind you what a very, very, very wise, ruggedly handsome man once said. It's easy to say stuff like that when you are safe and secure in a room locked away from danger. And it's easy to do stuff like that when you got your boys around you and you think they got your back. It is. And and maybe some of us would have done better. But we just would have stumbled someplace else. We just would have stumbled in a different way at a different time later. Because we're not the shot callers. Jesus is. Jesus is. So as we're going to just bring this thing to a close now, let me just say, we need to be very, very careful not to overestimate our own abilities or our own resistance to temptation. Don't put ourselves in Peter's position. We need to be very, very careful with that. Think about this. I mean, we've just walked through this. Every single person in today's text, from the Roman soldiers to the Jewish guards to Annas to the weird underling under lapdog guy to Peter, every single person in this tale today, in this narrative today, thought that in their own way they were calling the shots. They thought they were in control of the situation. The soldiers thought they were coming to arrest Jesus, but he floored them and handed himself over instead. The high priest thought he was interrogating Jesus, but Jesus flipped it on him and had him wanting out. Peter thought he was protecting Jesus, when in fact it was Jesus protecting him. Remember? Let these guys go. They all thought they were calling the shots, but none of them actually were. At any point. And the thing is, neither are we. Neither are we. And if we forget that, we are doomed to fail. We're just doomed to fail. We either make outrageous boasts like Peter did, and then we can't back them up, or we needlessly place ourselves in situations where we're going to be tested or tempted in ways that we're not really up to the challenge. Pride comes before the fall, as they say. Pride comes before the fall, and every single person in this account had more pride than they were justified in having. Every single one of them. And if you walk out that door today thinking that you're a shot caller, you're going to fall just like they did. So, just remember Jesus washing the disciples' feet a few chapters back. And remember, again, that took place earlier this very same night that this account is taking place. The exact same night. And what was it Jesus was trying to show us then? And what was he trying to show them? That our task isn't to exalt ourselves, but to humble ourselves. That's the task. And if we forget that, we're going to embarrass ourselves. Humble yourself, don't exalt yourself, or you will embarrass yourself. Like that's the progression there. Thankfully, Peter, he's going to get a chance to redeem himself. We're going to see that in a couple of chapters. He will. But I have to imagine he never forgot the shame and the humiliation of how just far he fell that night. I have to imagine he never forgot that, even after Jesus restored him. We are not the shot callers. Jesus the shot caller.